So let's get started today. Now, I want to pick up on something that Brian mentioned in my introduction, and that's that I'm a pilot by hobby. And so I've always been fascinated by the connections that I make between my interest in aviation and what it is that you do for your clients every single day. And I want to tell you a story of a couple of those connections that I've made, but in order for this story to make sense, you need to take this flight along with me. You need to be a passenger on flight 1549, 500 feet off the Hudson River and having just barely cleared the George Washington Bridge. And I want you to ask yourself a question. How valuable would it be to you and I as passengers on this flight to be able to freeze time just long enough for the flight attendants to get back up and run through that emergency water landing procedure just one more time, right? Maybe we're reading the journal back on the ground in LaGuardia. But that's the first connection that I made, that the value of advice is not only based on the content we deliver, but also the timing in which we deliver it. Now, a few seconds go by and splash, we're in the Hudson River. There's not one of us on this flight that doesn't understand it's time to stand up, find the nearest exit, and get off that airplane, right? And that's the second connection that I made, that having clarity of purpose drives actions. So let me put those two connections in terms of what I believe you do for your clients every single day. It's my belief that if we provide clients with timely and meaningful advice in sufficient quantity, that they're able to gain clarity, it's more likely that they'll take action. Would you agree? Okay, well, it's based on those two connections that I want to share with you what's been taking place in Washington over the recent past, how that's shaping the discussions that are happening right now and moving into the 2012 election cycle. But then I want to end our time today by sharing with you where we see, from our perspective, the opportunities are for you to help give your clients that clarity they need to help them move forward. So let's take a look at the 2011 budget, because the obvious answer and what we hear from Washington is we just need to cut spending and cut it quickly. Well, the 2011 federal budget was $3.8 trillion. Again, the good news is we're coming in at $3.6 trillion. But 58% of the 2011 budget is being spent on mandatory entitlements. And that's just the garden variety mandatory entitlements of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So we've talked about the changing demographics within the United States. What do you think is going to happen to that portion of the budget over the next 10, 15 years? It's just going to continue to expand, right? Now, 6% of our budget is currently being spent on debt service. And if you ask the White House, they tell us to expect that that portion of the budget will quadruple in the next 10 years. 23% of the budget is being spent on defense. So that's 87% of our budget that either historically won't change or cannot be changed without changing the laws in the United States. Impediments from moving forward. And the impediments are coming from all three parties involved, the president, the Republicans, and the Democrats. The president has said since his 2008 election campaign that he will not raise taxes on any families earning less than $250,000, despite the fact that the IRS came out with a report in May that you probably heard about, that 45% of American families didn't pay any federal income taxes, right? Now, if you read that full report, there was actually a more interesting statistic, and I'm not sure why it didn't get as much press, but it actually said that 45% of American families are actually receiving a proactive benefit from the federal government. So not just paid zero, but actually received a benefit from the United States government. Now, I know there's some double counting there. You have Social Security clients who are still working and paying taxes, and so those people would be double counted. But bottom line, we find ourselves in this environment where 45% of American families are taking benefits out of the federal system, while 55% of American families are paying in. It's simply not a long-term sustainable situation. Now, the Republicans, they're not any better. They say we won't raise taxes on anyone, despite the fact that on an inflation-adjusted basis, the U.S. federal government is bringing in revenues at the same level as 1958, the lowest level since 1958. The Democrats, they drew their line in the sand around entitlement benefits, and they said we will not address this long-term debt situation on the backs of entitlement programs. Now, that's where you've seen this pivot from debt and deficit to jobs. And I think that's been a fabulous or a very interesting transition that we've seen, because surely we can all agree we need more jobs in this country, right? But I saw it boiled down to this, a short-term versus a long-term dilemma. And this is where the whole jobs initiative is getting caught up. And what I mean by that is deficit cutting, as put forward by the Republicans, is by definition anti-jobs in the short run. Now, they will credibly argue that in the long run, a lower long-term debt puts the United States in a much better environment for long-term economic growth, and they would be right, of course. But by definition, it is anti-jobs in the short run. Now, stimulus, on the other hand, as put forth by the president, is pro-jobs in the short and intermediate term. If the government's spending more money on infrastructure projects or hiring teachers or police officers and so forth, that's pro-jobs in the short run. Now, the challenge that the Democrats have is then they have to address what are the impacts of the long-term deficit. This quote came out just recently, and I thought it was absolutely fabulous quote. This came out from the White House, and I'm going to summarize what this says or paraphrase what this says. It's from President Obama to the Republicans, and it simply says that, hey, Republicans, I've asked you all along for a balanced approach. And what I mean by that is I'm willing to give you spending cuts, but I want revenue increases, in other words, tax increases. If you fail to give me this balanced approach, I have a trump card in my pocket. And that trump card is the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. And I am fully prepared to allow the Bush tax cuts to expire on those families earning more than $250,000, but veto the portion of the bill that would apply to any families earning less than $250,000. So the reason this quote is fascinating, one, is it gave us perfectly clear, crystal quality view into what President Obama's belief is, what needs to happen around the taxation system in the United States. He believes the wealthiest portion of our population needs to be actively paying a higher contribution into the revenue stream. But what made this really fascinating was that it's factually wrong. The president can't do this. He can't veto half a law. Our president does not have line item veto power. So he'll be in a situation during that lame duck session next November and December and early January that he will be forced to make a decision of letting the Bush tax cuts expire on everyone or no one. That is his only choice unless Congress puts forth a more thoughtful approach to tax reform.